Okay, so here are some tips to help you with the more real-life demands of evaluating an argument that isn't a listicle. So let's get started. The first thing is, and I'll keep kind of coming back to this in this video, and that is that while the listicle was good practice for us to kind of learn the ropes of the system of analysis and evaluation and to learn the ropes of the website that we were using, it's not, we didn't do a lot of kind of sensitive, judgmental, refined ARG analysis on it. In the end, the listicles were pretty bad, or even if they were good in some respects, it was kind of obvious and an easy call about they were good in that respect or they were bad in this other respect. Real life arguments can be a little bit more complicated, and the idea here is that when we sit after we've kind of mapped out the argument and done quite a bit of informal ARG that we have to do in the back of our minds as we're trying to figure out where claims go and what people intended when they made a particular argument. When we actually get to the part where we're happy with the map and we're sitting down and taking a look at it, it's possible that that's not really the end, and then we kind of try and do our formal ARG analysis, write down our basis boxes and our R notes and things like that, and suddenly we go, oh, yeah, this part isn't good, but I guess that's why this sentence was in their argument. I guess I actually have to build my map out again or something like that. But generally speaking, when we get to the formal part of doing ARG and kind of writing those down in our map, um, they're going to be different than with the listicles. With the listicles, you probably had quite a few of your 5 reasons all have the same AR or A and R evaluations, and the G was fairly straightforward. Here, we're going to have maybe a wider variety of things going on. People with real world arguments are going to tend to draw from different sources, have different ways of arguing about things, and just because the map itself is going to be deeper, the kinds of relevance and the way that we're going to have to trace it through multiple steps from the base, from the bottom of the map all the way to the top, we're going to want to make sure that we do a good job there. So it's less of a kind of a phone it in kind of thing as we might have been doing on the listicles. And the other thing that's going on here that's kind of similar to the listicles is that we're really focused on just understanding what the author was trying to present as their argument. We're not going to try and supplement or change their argument to make it better. If we think that we've seen a mistake in it, we're going to try and do a little bit of work to make sure that that actually is what we think is a mistake or a weakness or a vulnerability in their argument, but we're not going to patch it. Okay, we're just going to try and identify, we're going to appreciate as much as we can the argument as it has been presented to us. That's in contrast to when we're going to use, if we used ARG on our own arguments, or if we were going to use argument evaluation on somebody else's argument with the eye to kind of taking it and making it our own argument, using it in our own, for our own uses. In those cases, we would use ARG, and if along the way we did identify weaknesses or flaws, we would try and patch them up, try and fix them, that kind of thing. All right. But right now, just focused on kind of understanding the overall cogency of their argument and whether it does have any specific issues. All right. So a reminder here, remember that the kind of the checklist, the recipe that we're going to do to evaluate A for our map, right, is first we have to kind of identify each end or tip of our map. So remember co-premises, each one of the white boxes in a co-premise box counts as a tip. So either has green boxes or something hanging off it or requires a basis box, right? For every end or tip of our map, we need to kind of figure out using rationale's kind of available choices there, which seems like the best fit for us, right? Pick an appropriate category of your basis box, right? And then the first thing you want to do in the text box of a basis box is just identify that actual source with more detail, right? So if it's author assertion, identify the author. If it's common belief, identify the audience for whom that claim is, at least allegedly, commonly believed, right? If it's an expert opinion, identify the specific expert. If it's a web page, don't identify the specific URL. Identify the web host, the kind of the root www.cnn.com, so that we know it comes from CNN. Don't give us the whole article name in there, right? And then the second thing that you do in that text is you articulate your judgment, your opinion. It's okay to have opinions here, right? Of the trustworthiness or the reliability of the source, right? And that's all we're doing in the A box. We're not trying to supply additional reasons. We're not adding in more information and detail about the green reason box above the basis box. We are evaluating here. So we're not adding in more information, we're evaluating, we're identifying the source, and we're judging the source, the quality of that source as a source. We're not judging the quality of the information itself, we're judging the source, all right? And then the last thing that you have to do is kind of sum it up. So at a glance, you can look at your map and see whether or not it was something that you thought was unacceptable, something that was acceptable, or something that you're kind of uncertain about the acceptability of it. All right. Now, when we're doing this, that was kind of what we did with listicles, but these are going to be different than listicles primarily because, hopefully, your real life article, your real life editorial, your real life argument that someone's presenting to you is not as dumb as the listicles, right? Remember, the listicles primarily for entertainment, not very rigorous standards there, but presumably the argument that you picked is actually interested in being legitimately persuasive. They've done their research, they've done their thinking, they think they're presenting a quality argument. So keep that in mind, right? Uh, Other things that are different from listicles is usually, not always, but usually they're going to rely less on appeals to common belief. They're going to rely less on just telling you the starting points of their arguments, the tips of their arguments, as just things that the author, have just asserted without further kind of evidence or backup. They're going to tend to rely more on expert opinions, whether that opinion is their own or somebody else's, and other allegedly reliable sources. So one quick thing to say about that, expert opinion is different than author assertion, right? Not because they're pointing at some other expert. They could still be kind of claiming the thing that they have in their argument could be a declaration that they themselves are making, but instead of author assertion, probably what we would want to do is use the expert opinion box if they are in any kind of respect putting themselves forth as an expert on that particular claim, right? So often you'll get an editorial that is written by somebody who is, intimately connected with the news story or something like that they're writing the editorial about. And so more appropriate when they make declarations that are the tips of their arguments to evaluate them as experts themselves and take a look at their trustworthiness as experts rather than call it an author assertion. All right. We do want to give them some benefit of the doubt, right? At least initially. We want to presume that people making arguments are doing them in good faith and that they think that if it was worth writing on paper, that it's going to be something that's legitimate, and that if they have picked starting points for their premises, for their branches, right, those tips, they presumably are thinking those are great places to start. Those are okay, non-controversial, acceptable statements to make that will be accepted by the intended audience of their argument. We're not gonna 100% gonna do that. Otherwise, that would just skip over A, right? And we just give everything check marks. No, we want to give them some benefit of the doubt for that, and presume that they think their starting places are acceptable. What we're really trying to do here is kind of try and figure out why, right? So they appealed to an expert. Presumably, they think that expert is a legitimate, relevant, well-qualified expert. We're still going to have to articulate our own judgment about whether we agree with them on that, right? But that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're at least giving them some initial benefit of the doubt, but we're not going to substitute their judgment for ours on that, right? One of the other key things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about real life arguments is that the real intended audience often factors in quite a bit when determining the acceptability, right? So we got to keep that in the back of our minds. What kind of publication have they used to host their particular argument? What kind of audience are they anticipating come looking at it? It might not be you, right? Because you've kind of scoured the internet looking for this argument. Maybe you aren't the typical audience. So just kind of keep that in mind if they have a substantially different audience than you, and how would that audience evaluate acceptability? They might be tougher on certain things than you are, or they might be more lenient about certain things, and they might have common beliefs, things that they commonly believe, that audience, that you don't, right? So keep those things in mind. When it comes to R, again, here's the checklist, right? We need to shade all of the colored boxes in our map. In every diagram, we want to shade them all, okay? So that means they can't just say supports with that default shade of green. You have to get it to say weakly or strongly or doesn't support the gray, right? We still, just like the listicles, I'm only going to require that you post 2 yellow R notes per diagram. Now, remember, in principle, right, every single link is deserving of a relevance note, because every single link, we want to evaluate the relevance to make sure that they're all relevant, but I only need a sampling. I only need 2 notes for you to articulate, for me to check things. Now, if you submit a map, right, I might direct you, hey, look at this link right here and give me an R note on this link, because I think it's a key or an interesting or an unusual link, and I want to see kind of what you think about it as well, right? But usually what we're don't pick 2 easy ones. I know that's probably the tendency, right? But you can pick a link between any 2 rows from that top row of reasons up to the conclusion. You could pick to evaluate the R of one of those main reasons, or you could pick something lower down as well. So, pick something unusual, right? And then use the way that I've talked about in the rationale tutorial section about evaluating R. Follow that model of contemplating, well, if this support was in fact not true, would that make me change my mind about the box that it allegedly supports, right? And again, contrasting the job of evaluating R in this case with listicles, the chief thing here is that it's not going to be dumb, right? And there's going to be more layers, so there's going to be kind of maybe more interesting relevance relationships going on here. It's not going to be maybe as obvious how one thing supports another thing, right? It is okay in these to have weakly relevant, or perhaps even doesn't support evaluations of particular links, though again, we're going to give some benefit of the doubt to the author. The author, at least if they're arguing in good faith, we're going to give them that presumption at the start, right? They're going to think that I got a typo there, they're going to think that those links are relevant, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have made them, but they could have been fooling themselves, right? They might have not done the kind of evaluation in depth and as kind of accurately and perspicaciously as we do. And so they might have fooled themselves into thinking that some particular claim is in fact relevant to something else, but when we're more carefully evaluating, we might go, no, it's not, right? So there might be the case that we have some gray boxes that we've evaluated are a little bit harshly on some links, but typically that's not the case, right? Somebody who's kind of invested enough effort into constructing their argument is probably not going to have irrelevant premises or reasons supporting their argument, but it does happen, right? We have our 4G questions. Deploy those. Remember, 2 of these, answer 2 of these, and please answer them completely. Most of these G questions that I've supplied here have like 2 parts. Don't just answer the first part, answer both parts, okay? And again, right, this is going to be different than listicles. Hopefully, right, your editorial is not going to be completely one-sided like your listicle probably tended to be, right? They probably are going to have an objection or 2 in them, so answering some of those G questions are going to be a little bit more interesting, a little bit more involved than they were for the listicle. And again, there's my typo. Give some benefit of the doubt to the author who thinks that their argument is sufficient to carry the day, right? They wouldn't have probably published that article arguing for a particular point if they didn't think the kinds of things they talked about were sufficient enough to convince people that that's a legitimate and cogent conclusion to reach, right? So we're trying to figure out why they think that, and we're okay to disagree, right? But the presumption should be, okay, they probably have a pretty good idea of what's going on here, right? That being said, usually the thing that's the most kind of vulnerable to G at least, and sometimes with A, but mostly with G, is that authors tend to not be sufficiently aware of the degree of skepticism that there might be out there in the real world about their argument, because people live with their arguments and their positions and their viewpoints a lot. So we tend to overestimate how persuasive and how familiar our arguments are to other people. So this could be the weakest component of A, R, and G, because when the author is thinking, have I said enough to back up my points here, they're going to jump to yes maybe quicker than they should, right? The other thing that's a little bit tricky here, it's also a factor for A and R when it comes to real world arguments, but especially for G, is that this does require some subject knowledge of your own. You need to be somewhat familiar with the argument, with the area that they're arguing about, to sufficiently evaluate G. For example, right, it's going to be hard for you, right, to identify potential underminers, that is unacknowledged objections, if you don't know very much about that argument, about that topic yourself, right? It's going to be hard for you to identify remaining skeptics if you don't have some kind of lay of the land about who's arguing for what, whether that particular argument has another side to it, a bunch of people who are fans of another conclusion and think that they have a strong argument, right? They're going to definitely be remaining skeptics for the argument as presented, right? They might not be so aware of that stuff. You might not. You need to be aware of that landscape of the argument to do a good G evaluation. All right. Hopefully those quick tips were enough to help you set you on the right track when it comes to doing the ARG for the editorial. Next in this module is to actually do that ARG evaluation. And then once you pass that, that's going to open up the second module, which is kind of a repeat of this one, but with less steps. You get right to it and just rack up some more points on a second in real life argument as more practice. Or you could switch over to the essay project and start in on that. There's more points in that module, but it's got more steps. It's more involved. Your choice.